let's move into session 2, which is titled Women and Children's Mental Health in the Climate Crisis. And we'll look at addressing the link between mental health in the climate crisis and the realities of women and children's mental health, what can be done, and what is needed to strengthen or improve the mental health stigma and institutions across countries. We've been hearing this all throughout this morning's conversation thus far. But before I hand over to you, today's moderator will be introducing to you a Gen Z video by one of our partners from the Climate Mental Health Network.
Last year, the UN described the current climate crisis as a code red for humanity.
I feel like I constantly see on the news about unprecedented fires and floods and hurricanes. I think about how people aren't going to be affected by these things equally.
It's sort of like picking at me. If you don't do this, then the world's going to end or something like that.
On a selfish level, I would like to have children, but with what I see at the moment, I'm not super sure it's a great idea.
It's becoming more unbearable for folks to be living in this part of the region and seeing how that's going to affect us in the future and what we can do now to stop that.
I think my biggest fear would be people will continue fighting against each other and finding things to fear instead of focusing how we can work together and create solutions and think positively and help each other.
Thank you. And now I'd like to hand over this panel discussion to Lilan, our Hate Ambassador from Sri Lanka. Lilan, over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the panel, Women's and Children's Mental Health in the Climate Crisis. I'm Lilan Dayananda, a Commonwealth Youth Awardee for Excellence in Development Work in 2022. I'm an ambassador at the Hay Campaign and the Minister of Agriculture and Food Security at Hay Parliament. I'm the founder and managing director of LCN Agro Private Limited that provides climate-smart, data-driven precision agriculture solutions to increase crop yields organically while utilizing limited resources at an optimum level. Today, during this session, we will talk about how climate change is affecting vulnerable groups such as women and children's mental health in different ways. And we will hear a little bit about the amazing work each of our panelists is making. We have 5 amazing panelists here with us today. It is an honor to be moderating this session with you. Before starting the session, I would like to inform our audience that they can ask questions during the session. So feel free to write your questions in the Q&A chat box. If you want to direct your question to a specific panelist, you can write their names along with your question. To our panelists, I hate to bring up the time limits, but just reminding you that you have approximately 3 minutes to answer each question so that the panel can finish within the given time. So let's begin. First of all, I would like to introduce Priyanka Lalla. She's a Hay ambassador and her advocacy is focused on climate action, education, non-communicable diseases, and violence and abuse against children. Due to an urgent matter, she is not available here with us. However, she shared us a video recording answering her question. The question was, extreme water stress already affects a quarter of the world's population and is expected to increase with global heating, aggravating famine, civil conflict, forced migration, and war. How do these negative effects impact mostly women's and children's mental well-being? Our technical team will share a video now.
As small island developing states, we are uniquely impacted by the climate crisis. We see and feel the effects of climate change on a daily basis. And when we are threatened by flash flooding, bushfires, hurricanes, drought, and coastal erosion and flooding, everyone is affected, especially those in the lower socioeconomic bracket. And this affects the livelihoods and the ability to live, having to rebuild their lives. This takes a major toll on the mental health of families, specifically within these families, the women and children. UN global figures indicate that 80% of people displaced by the climate crisis are women. And for centuries, universally, women have generally been seen as the homemakers, placed with the responsibility of the upbringing of children and the household. And when faced by the effects of climate change, this changes their ability to survive, thrive, and provide for themselves and their children. Oftentimes, when these families face the effects of climate change, children are taken out of school to earn an income or even to be forced into child marriages. Having your life be uprooted and being deprived the access to your fundamental human rights affects your mentality, the way you think, and how you feel. And there's a loss of hope. However, despite this, women and girls have the capacity to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis by changing the culture behind how it is perceived. Specifically, the knowledge gap and the learning crisis must be addressed. The relevant information on what is happening and, more importantly, how we can adapt must be made accessible. We need community outreach programs, capacity building opportunities, and simply having green skills and the specific information to be implemented into our school curriculums and households. This is a call to action for our governments and policymakers. Think about where the funding is going. Ensure that there's transparency and accountability, and that the most marginalized groups, women and children, are given the information and the opportunities.
That was insightful. Moving to our next panelist, I would like to introduce Hannah Hooper. She's a climate activist and the program's coordinator at Force of Nature. Hi, Hannah. My question for you is, childhood is a period of extremely high developmental vulnerability when most psychiatric disorders are firstly established. With the drastic and visible climate change, how we can utilize or create effective and adaptive strategies for children's mental health with nature-based remedies or solutions.
Hi, thank you, Lilan, and thank you all for being here and inviting me to join this panel. I'm really, really grateful to be connecting with you all and hearing from such amazing speakers. So I guess I'd like to say, firstly, I'm not a psychologist by any means. However, I can speak from my personal experience as a young person and through the work we do at Force of Nature. So Force of Nature is a youth non-for-profit mobilizing mindsets for climate action. And we empower young people to turn their anxiety, or specifically eco-anxiety, into agency and to realize their potential as change makers. And we realize that the threat, even greater than the climate crisis, is how powerless we feel in the face of it. And we won't solve this crisis until we mobilize mindsets. And this is why we work at the intersection of mental health and mental well-being and the climate crisis. And through studies we've done at Force of Nature, we found that 70% of young people feel hopeless in the face of the climate crisis, while only 26% know how to contribute to solving the problem. And women and children are often the first to feel the impacts of the climate crisis and the resulting mental health issues. We have found that thousands of young people that we have worked with, and that one of the most effective ways of supporting young people who are suffering from things like eco-anxiety is actually giving them the space to talk about how they're feeling. And it seems so simple because it really is. And when a young person, for example, is sat in a classroom, such as, I don't know, like a science classroom, learning about runaway climate change and the heating of the planet, how are they supposed to process and work through this information when they're not given the space to do so? So we see schools and education really holding the key to supporting young people who are experiencing climate-related emotions. And I guess that's kind of the second part to my answer, and that is we need to be upskilling teachers and people who are working with young people to support their students and really give them the knowledge on how to facilitate conversations where young people and children can express how they're actually feeling and turn that anxiety that they may be feeling into action. Because we found that often our emotions can actually be the reason for us taking action rather than not. So yeah, I think focusing on education and supporting teachers and creating spaces for conversations about how young people and children are feeling is really, really important.
Thank you, Hannah. That was really insightful. Moving to our next panelist, I would like to introduce Hakima Abbas. She is a co-executive director of the Black Feminist Fund, a global feminist fund dedicated to significantly increasing the resources available to Black feminist movements. Hi, Hakima. So, climate change will be a key driver of existing social and health inequalities. And tracking and mitigating these effects is therefore a matter of social justice. How we can involve more women in policy making and decision making on climate action.
Thank you, and hello, Lilan. Thank you for this question, and thank you all for being here and for the great panelists. It's been such an enriching conversation. In terms of the question that you're asking, I almost want to reframe it, because you asked the question, how climate change will be a key driver of existing social and health inequalities. And I do think we have to put that actually in the present tense. Climate change is already a key driver of existing inequalities. And I think in many ways, the reverse is also true, that the drivers of inequality and of climate change and the whole ecological disaster are in many ways one and the same. They stem from systems of continued colonialism and capitalist exploitation of land and of labor, of people, of water, of ecosystems, and of women's bodies. And so the second part of the question, though, was how can we involve more women in policymaking and decision-making on climate change? A Black feminist, Dr. Shirley Chisholm, famously once said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And I wonder if, given the urgency of this moment in the world and this moment of ecological disaster, whether we also just need to flip the table. What I mean by that is often these decision-making tables are made outside and away from the realities of people of the majority world. The tables are made without the input of young people, of women, of gender expansive people, of impoverished people, and decision-making tables that exclude the most impacted, the most oppressed, can only find false solutions. So let's flip them. I think Black and Indigenous women, girls, and gender expansive people are creating our own tables, our own strategies and plans that really come from the people. And those are the strategies that need to be resourced and supported and enabled in order for us to really find the solutions for climate justice.
Thank you, Hakima. Actually, you are right. We are already going through the problem and we have to work right now. So moving to our next panelist, Sarah Newman. She's a co-founder of the Climate Mental Health Network, which addresses the mental health impacts of climate change. Hi, Sarah. My question to you. The impact of climate change on physical health are now well documented, but the mental health is also being affected. According to your perspective, how to measure women's and children's mental health in the climate crisis?
Thanks so much for this great question, and just thanks again for having me here today. And I'm diligently taking notes, listening to all of the incredible speakers today. And so the Climate Mental Health Network primarily is working in the United States right now. And so I can share a little bit about more US focused statistics aside from, but first I'll start with a global statistic, which is that the Lancet did a study last year of 10,000 youth worldwide to understand about how the climate crisis is affecting young people's mental health. And of that study of 10,000 youth, 75% of the youth surveyed said that the future is frightening, and 4 in 10 said that they are hesitant to have children. And the data about the United States is tracking the same. There was a study that was done about a year and a half ago in the United States of people 18 to 24, and 83% said they worry about climate change, 75% said it affects their mental health. And so what we're really seeing is that, young people are growing up in a world that, with this existential crisis, they have not created this, but it is that they're living with the extreme consequences of it. And in terms of what their life choices are, whether to have children, what they're doing with their lives, everything is impacted by the climate crisis. And one of the approaches, I am not a Gen Zer, I'm a Gen Xer, but one of the things that I really do like to talk about is that while my generation and other generations bear a huge responsibility for what is happening with this climate crisis, I also see this huge opportunity for very strong intergenerational work so that young people don't feel that it's just up to them to address this climate crisis, and to know that there are people, scientists, advocates, policymakers who are really trying to do the right thing and address the climate crisis. Obviously, everyone has come up short at this point, but that the burden should not just be carried by young people. And then I think, all of the speakers have, many of the speakers have already spoken about the disproportionate impacts also to women in terms of, that how women are not at the negotiating table when it comes to climate policies, when at a global level and a national level, in terms of who is impacted the most by environmental disasters caused by climate change. It's, women and children who are living in frontline communities. And I think another aspect to women, it's what this Lancet study had shown, that 4 in 10 young people are unsure if they want to have children. And here in the United States, there's a woman named Dr. Jade Sasser, who is an advisor to the Climate Mental Health Network. And she has done some research about the reproductive choices of young people in the United States because of the climate crisis. And her research has shown that BIPOC communities, Black, Brown, and Indigenous young people are more likely to choose not to have children because of the climate crisis than white young people. So it's, impacting women and children, obviously, much more strongly than other people rather. But I really think that one of the opportunities is, again, like I said, like this intergenerational work so that young people are not feeling isolated, so that women are not feeling isolated.
Thank you, Sarah. Your answer was very insightful. Moving to our next panelist, Clara Marmolejo. She's a lead volunteer for Girl-Led Action on Climate Change and World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts. She's a language therapist by career and passionate for girl-led non-formal education. Hi, Laura. How can the education sector support women and children's mental health in the climate crisis?
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I want to award these questions talking about 3 specific things. First is a safe space, offer a precise information, and then be part of a solution. The threats of climate change are a concerning topic for everyone. climate anxiety, that are negative emotions associated with the perception of climate change, is becoming a common feeling, especially among young people. When learning about climate change, girls can feel worried about the impact of climate change on their future, helpless against the present consequences. We gotta give them a space to share. Learning about climate change, especially in areas that are very vulnerable to its consequences, can be very upsetting. If girls are expressing or showing signs of anxiety, we have to give them the space to share their concerns and acknowledge their emotions. We have to research precise information. Climate change is a reality, and we are living its consequences already, as some of the other panelists have mentioned. But feeling worried about it might mean that some girls keep thinking about the worst possible scenarios. Non-formal education encourages people to explore and be realistic about the consequences of climate change in their daily lives. We have to support them to research and use accurate information. We have to be part of a solution. Working together towards solutions can help women and young people feel empowered. Non-formal education gives girls and women the tools to become environmental leaders and change makers in their lives, in their families, and in their communities. We have to help them focus on how they can take action. It is a great way to make sure that they stay motivated and hopeful.
Thank you, Laura. That really makes sense. So let's move on to Q&A session. So as a general question, any panelist can answer this question from their perspective. This question came from one of our audience. The question is, how do we support women with vulnerability to mental health when support from hospitals and spouses are lacking? If I may repeat the question again, how do we support women with vulnerability to mental health when support from hospitals and spouses are lacking? Clara, would you like to answer?
Sure, I could start again, just because the organization is focused on the U.S. So one of the challenges here in the United States is access to healthcare. So for many people in the United States, our healthcare system is very, very complex here, but and very expensive. And so for many, many people in the United States, they do not have access to healthcare, and particularly do not have access to mental health care. It's generally a private model that you have to pay for, and it's built on a one-on-one therapy model. So for many, many people, they don't have access to mental health care. And so a lot of the work that we do is focus on reaching people outside of the healthcare system, knowing that it is so inaccessible, particularly to communities, to women, to communities that are under-resourced, disinvested communities. And there's also, just a lot of challenges in terms of, there's a lot of historical racism and discrimination in our healthcare system and our mental health care system. So there's a lot of distrust as well. So our programming and our focus is very much is focused on meeting people at the community level in places that are safe and accessible to them, rather than focusing on the healthcare system.
Thank you, Sarah. That's another question coming from the audience. I think this question is more related to Laura. So the question is, do you think that mental health troubleshooting and awareness should be incorporated into the school syllabus? What do you think, Laura?
Well, I am not an expert in a school setting system, since my organization works in non-formal education, and we are more like a support and other kind of education out of a normal school setting, as I mentioned before. I think it is very important to include mental health education in all our spaces. It is basic information that everyone needs just to have current logical development of emotions, to know how to deal with life. Because mental health is not only related to climate change, which is our main topic at the moment, but it's as well related to every part of our everyday life. And if you don't have the tools to cope up with what can come up, it is very hard to be successful. So yes, I think it definitely should be included in all education systems. And we, in my organization specifically, we work trying to give girls and young women information and spaces to share. It's super important to have a brave space, a safe space where someone can just come up and open up, maybe just talk it out, could be a good way of helping. And we are always willing to hear and support how necessary.
Thank you, Laura. Really makes sense. I would like to ask a question from Hakima. How we can attract more funds for women and children's mental health development?
I think that's a really important question. At the Black Feminist Fund, we're trying to make sure that funds go directly to those that are most impacted and those that are more oppressed, and that funding, I think it's not just more funds, but also the type of funding. I think funding should go in ways that enable people to create their own strategies, not just what we're fighting against, all of the ways in which we're fighting back to protect rivers and oceans and lands and all of our ecosystems, but also funding for us to build new visions and to support the visions and experiments and the science of farmers and rural people and, again, Black and Indigenous women around the world. I think Adriana mentioned the figures on gender investments and how small they are. We also know that only 0.22%, so 0.22% of bilateral climate funding goes to feminists, women-led and women's rights organizations and movements and institutions. And of course, that figure is even smaller when you break it down to those that are led by Black and Indigenous women and girls. So it's really important that we shift that. And as we think about funding, it's also important to note that a lot of funding goes to false solutions. So we have to push for the solutions that come from the people to really be the focus, rather than continuing the cycle by funding large corporations who have done a lot of the harm to continue to do that.
Thank you, Hakima. And there's another question coming from the audience. The question is, are there any statistical projections or survey charts that outline predictions of mental health as it related to the climate crisis, either increasing or declining? Any of our panelists would like to answer this? Are there any statistical projections on this matter?
I can just say very briefly from what we do at Force Image, and I mentioned this before, but we did a study amongst over 1,000 young people in 50 countries, asking them, how they feel about the climate crisis. And, we had an overwhelming response of 70% saying that they felt hopeless in the face of the climate crisis, and only 26% feeling like they could solve the problem. And I feel like if we were to do another study, we did the study in 2020 into 2021. If we were to do this again, I feel like the stats would be higher, especially as the term of eco-anxiety is becoming more and more prevalent. It's being spoken about a lot more. And I think now that it's being spoken about a lot more people are realizing, oh, that's actually me. I've been feeling these things and I couldn't really pinpoint it or get a grasp on what it was I was feeling. So I'm sure there are many countless studies online. Maybe they're in terms of referencing, there could be something by Climate Psychologies Alliance. They do a lot of studies and statistics and research into the impact of the climate crisis on mental health and specifically young people's mental health. So that could be a good place to look.
Thank you, Hannah. I would like to ask you a question once again. You can briefly answer this. So the question is, what are some of the negative and positive effects of responding to climate change and its impact on women and children's mental health?
Yeah, great question. So I guess I don't want to say like there's necessarily negative effects to responding to climate change, as I don't think we can ignore it. However, I do believe that, as I was saying, with the rise in knowledge about the climate crisis, this is having a negative impact on, not just women and children, but everyone's mental health, as more people are suffering with things like eco-anxiety. And the more we become apprised of what is happening, the scarier the issue becomes. But the climate crisis is not something we can ignore, and we can't turn a blind eye to it. And it really demands immediate action. So multiple studies have shown that women are more likely to die or become climate refugees due to climate change and climate disasters. And although women are forced to bear the brunt of the consequences of climate change, they have been systematically excluded from decision-making rooms and really denied the agency in deciding when and how to overcome the vulnerabilities they face. So I do believe that one of the positive effects of responding to climate change is it's asking us to completely reimagine old structures and paradigms, which are clearly no longer working. For example, getting more women who are working at the local level into decision-making rooms because they have the necessary experience to know what it is that their community needs. And when we do this, we're not only responding to the climate crisis, but we're also challenging gender stereotypes, which are still permeating society. So I guess those are kind of some positives and negatives, but I'd say generally responding is going to ultimately, hopefully, lead to positive outcomes.
Thanks once again, Hannah. Young people today will bear the long-term burden of living with and solving climate change despite being least responsible for causing it. And swift and effective action to minimize this burden is therefore a matter of international and intergenerational justice, as well as a substantive practical imperative. It is essential for effective and mitigation planning and a vital investment in the mental health and well-being of women and children. Before ending this session, if I may let you know the key takeaways from the panel, we got to know about the current trajectory of climate action and justice, negative and positive effects of responding to climate change and its impact on women and children, mental health, the impact of nature-based solutions for women and children's mental well-being, involvement of women in policymaking and decision-making of climate action, criteria to measure women and children's mental health in the climate crisis, and the responsibility of education sector to support women's and children's mental health in the climate crisis. I would like to thank all of our panelists for their valuable insights, and I would like to appreciate our audience for their valuable engagement during the session. Thank you very much once again. Hi, Ashley. Over to you for carry on the session.
Hi, Lilan. Thank you very much for passing over the session. I must say that was a very exciting, invigorating, educational, and insightful morning in which we had thus far. And I mean, we got a lot out of the discussions thus far. And at this time, I would now move directly into session 3, which is a bit different and is entitled Inclusive Action, the Role of Men and the Inclusion of Vulnerable Groups. The moderator for this session is